Housekeeper found it. Every single day. But no one asked what it was. There are things that exist in hotel rooms, the way secrets exist in families, present every morning, never acknowledged, quietly endured. A folded note tucked beneath a Bible. A child's shoe under the radiator. A ring left on the edge of the sink, still warm. Most of these things disappear by checkout. The guests reclaim them, the housekeepers discard them, and the rooms return to their neutral blankness, ready to absorb the next stranger's life for 48 or 72 hours before becoming empty again. But some things stay. Some things appear so consistently, in the same place with the same quiet insistence, that they stop being forgotten objects and begin to feel like messages. Whether anyone is listening is a different matter entirely. If stories like this one, about the people who clean the spaces where we fall apart, matter to you, this channel is for you. We tell the stories no one thinks to ask about, the ones hidden in plain sight. If you found yourself here, consider subscribing. Stay until the end. What happened in room 114 was noticed by exactly one person, and for a long time, that person wished she hadn't noticed at all. Her name was Celestine. She had been working in housekeeping at the hotel for 11 years. She was not the kind of person who invited conversation. She arrived at the service entrance at 6:45 every morning, changed into her uniform without looking at the other women on her shift, and pulled her cart down the corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible in spaces that did not belong to her. She was 43 years old. She had 2 sons. She sent money home every month to her mother, who lived far away in a country Celestine had not visited in 6 years. These were the facts of her life. She did not share them at work. Room 114 was not special. It sat at the end of the east corridor, slightly smaller than the rooms on either side of it, its single window facing the building's interior courtyard rather than the street. Guests rarely requested it. It was the kind of room assigned when every other option had been taken, a last resort, a compromise. The bed was the same as every other bed on the floor. The carpet was the same grey-beige. The bathroom had the same white towels folded into the same triangles, the same miniature bottles arranged in a line that would be rearranged or consumed or knocked into the trash by morning. The first time Celestine found it, she thought nothing of it. It was a Monday. The guest in room 114 had checked out. She entered with her passkey, left the door propped open the way she always did, and began the systematic dismantling of someone else's temporary life, stripping the bed, collecting the damp towels, noting on her clipboard what needed to be restocked. She was moving toward the bathroom when she saw it on the nightstand, a small orange prescription bottle, empty with no label. She picked it up, turned it over once, and set it in her cart's trash bin without another thought. Things people left behind were rarely worth thinking about. She found it again the following Monday. A different guest had occupied room 114. She could see the evidence of a different kind of person in the way things had been arranged, the specific chaos of a business traveler versus a tourist. And yet, there it was on the nightstand. Same small orange bottle, no label, empty. She paused for 3 full seconds before she placed it in the trash. She told herself it was coincidence. By the 4th Monday, she had stopped telling herself anything. She simply noted it, the way you note a recurring pain. Not with alarm, not with dismissal, but with the quiet recognition that something is asking to be understood. The bottle was always in the same position. Always on the right side of the nightstand, cap up. Perfectly centered on the small square of wood, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, as though it were meant to be found by someone who would not ask questions. Celestine was that person. She had learned early in her career at the hotel that questions were expensive. The first time she had reported something that seemed irregular, a child's backpack left in a room for 3 days after checkout, a situation she worried about, she had been called into a supervisor's office and told, carefully and without cruelty, that her job was to clean rooms and not to generate incidents. She had understood. She had not asked again. The 11 years of silence that followed had been the direct result of that single lesson. So she threw away the bottle each Monday, and each Monday it returned. Weeks became a month. The month extended into 2. She began to notice other patterns, Room 114 was always booked on weekends, Friday and Saturday nights, then empty Sunday, then occupied again Monday morning through Wednesday. The Monday morning guest checked in very early, before 6, which meant the night staff handled the key. Celestine never saw this person. She only saw the room after they left. She only saw the bottle. There are silences that accumulate the way debt accumulates, slowly, invisibly, until the weight of what has not been said becomes structural. Celestine carried this small, growing weight without anyone knowing she was carrying it. She went home on those Monday evenings and sat at the kitchen table in the apartment she shared with her youngest son, who was 17 and rarely spoke to her in the evenings anymore, each of them carrying their private weights in the same small space. She heated food she did not taste. She did not sleep until very late. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had crossed oceans. She had navigated bureaucracies that had treated her as an obstacle rather than a person. She had worked alongside women who cried in the linen closets and then returned to work, and she had been one of those women once or twice early on. But she had built herself into someone who did not cry at work, someone who finished her shifts, completed her clipboards, returned her cart to the storage room and left. The hotel did not give her more than it needed to. She had learned to not give it more than she needed to either. The trouble was that the bottle each week was asking something of her. Not loudly, not urgently, but with that particular persistence of things that exist in the space between what is seen and what is acknowledged. She began to look at it differently, to notice its dimensions. It was a standard 30-count prescription bottle, the kind used for pills taken daily, the kind that would be empty in a month if someone took one per day. Every Monday, it was empty. Every Friday, presumably, it arrived full. She worked this out one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, and then sat very still for a long time with the calculation in front of her. Someone was using room 114 as a drop, not occasionally, systematically, every single week for at least 2 months, possibly longer before she began to notice. The pattern was too precise to be anything else. The early Monday check-in, the room always available on those specific days, the bottle centered on the nightstand like a receipt left behind for someone. The question was whether the someone it was left behind for was ever meant to be her. She cleaned the room on that Monday with particular care. She did not throw away the bottle. She carried it down the corridor in her apron pocket and stood in the linen closet for 4 minutes alone, holding it and deciding what she was. She was a woman who had been told 11 years ago not to generate incidents. She was a woman who sent money home every month, whose job was not replaceable at this stage of her life, whose visa status was tied to her continued employment, whose son needed her to still be here next year and the year after. She was a woman who had learned that the space between noticing and reporting was a space you entered at your own risk. She put the bottle back in room 114, exactly where she had found it. She smoothed the bedspread. She closed the door. She finished her shift. That evening she told herself she would wait 1 more week. If the pattern repeated, she would decide then. But 1 more week came and went, and the decision remained unmade, because every time she stood in that room with the bottle in her hand, the calculation was always the same, the risk of speaking against the certainty of staying silent. Silence was known. Silence was survivable. What speaking might cost her she could only estimate. 3 months into her discovery, a new supervisor was assigned to the housekeeping department. His name was Marcus, and he was 29 years old and had the particular energy of someone recently promoted, attentive in ways that felt performative, friendly in ways that hadn't yet settled into ease. He made rounds at unpredictable hours. He asked questions the previous supervisor had never asked. He wanted to know if anything had seemed unusual in any of the rooms recently. He asked this at a department meeting, scanning the row of women facing him. Celestine looked at her hands. She had told no one about room 114. Not the other women on her shift. Not Anna, who had worked the East Corridor for 8 years and who sometimes handed Celestine coffee without being asked, a small kindness Celestine had come to depend on without acknowledging. Not her son. Not anyone. The knowing had lived in her body alone, which was where the heaviest things always lived. She felt it in the way she slowed slightly when she turned the corner onto the East Corridor on Monday mornings. In the way her hand tightened on the passkey, before she slid it into the door of room 114. Marcus moved on to other matters. The meeting ended. The women collected their clipboards and dispersed into the building's many corridors, each of them carrying the day's particular instructions, and Celestine pushed her cart to the east wing and worked her way down the hall and stood in front of room 114 at 9:47 in the morning and did not move for a long moment before she pushed the door open. The bottle was there. Of course it was. What changed that day was not her decision. It was the realization that no decision was itself a decision. She had been choosing every Monday for 3 months to know what she knew and say nothing. She had done this consciously and deliberately, and some part of her had told herself that this was a temporary state, that eventually something external would shift the equation and she would not have to act. But nothing external was going to shift. The bottle would keep returning. The Monday guest would keep checking in before dawn, and she would keep cleaning the room and carrying the secret and lying awake at the kitchen table, while her son sat across from her in a silence of his own. She took the bottle. Not to throw it away. She had done that many times and it had changed nothing. She put it in her apron pocket and finished the room and went through the rest of her shift and at the end of the day placed the bottle in the bottom of her bag and carried it home. She had no plan. She had only a small orange bottle and the exhausted clarity of someone who has been carrying a weight alone for too long and has finally run out of places to set it down. The weight of discovery is a particular kind of exhaustion. It is not the tiredness of labor. That kind she understood, had lived with, had made her peace with years ago. This was something different. It was the tiredness of knowing more than you were supposed to know, in a place where knowing things was not your function. Celestine had worked in the hotel for 11 years, and she understood her function precisely. To restore order to spaces that had been disrupted by human presence, to make the evidence of occupation disappear so that the next occupant could pretend the room was theirs alone. She was good at this. It was work that required attention, consistency, a particular kind of invisible intelligence. But she had attended to something she was not supposed to attend to, and now that attending had consequences. She understood this the way you understand a shift in weather, not through analysis, but through the body, through something cold at the back of the neck that arrives before the rain does. Her youngest son was awake when she got home. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him, in a posture she had learned to read as waiting. She set her bag down without looking at him. "You okay?" he asked. "Tired," she said, the way she always said it. She did not show him the bottle. She put her bag in the bedroom and came back and made food, and they ate in the kitchen in the kind of silence that had grown between them over years. Not hostile, not cold, just the silence of two people who had learned to coexist without intruding on each other's private lives. Her son was 17 and had the particular solitude of teenagers who sense that their parents are carrying things they don't want to share. He did not press her. She did not offer. The bottle sat at the bottom of her bag in the other room like a small, persistent weight. In the weeks that followed, she began to do something she had not done before. She paid attention to the hotel's systems rather than simply operating within them. Who received the reservations for room 114? Who processed the early Monday check-ins? Whether the same employee had handled the key each week, she was not investigating. She had no authority to investigate, no access to the reservation system, no reason anyone would explain any of this to her. She was simply watching the way you watch something when you don't know what else to do. The way you gather information when speaking is still not an option. What she saw was this. The front desk employee who worked Sunday nights into Monday mornings was always the same young man, early 20s, unhurried in his manner, the kind of person who seemed slightly too comfortable in the job. She had noticed him before only abstractly, the way you notice the architecture of a building you enter every day. Now she began to look more carefully. He never looked toward the housekeeping entrance. He kept his eyes on his screen or his phone. When she passed through the lobby in her uniform, she was furniture to him. This she knew could mean nothing. She was furniture to most of them. She carried this watching alone for another 3 weeks. The bottle kept appearing. She kept collecting it and bringing it home. By now she had 4 of them on the shelf in her closet behind a pair of shoes she never wore. 4 identical orange bottles, no labels, perfectly empty. She had started thinking of them as evidence, though she had not yet decided what they were evidence of, or who she might show them to. The word evidence implied a next step, and she had not located the next step. She had only the bottles and the watching and the sleeplessness, and the growing sense that she had passed some invisible threshold beyond which silence had a different quality than it had before. The invisible weight of knowing has a physical address in the body. For Celestine it lived between her shoulder blades, a tightness that arrived on Sunday evenings and did not fully release until she had cleaned room 114 on Monday mornings, and the bottle was in her pocket and the room was restored to its empty neutrality. She was not sleeping well, she was eating mechanically. She was answering her son's occasional questions with single words, and she could see that he was watching her with the particular attention of a child who has learned to read small changes in a parent's behavior as indicators of larger instabilities. She did not want him to worry. She had spent 17 years arranging her life so that he would not have to carry her worries as well as his own. She had built careful separations between the life she showed him and the life she actually lived, and she had told herself for years that this was not deception, but protection. But the bottles were accumulating in her closet, and the Sunday evenings were getting longer, and one night she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the shoes in front of her and thought, if something happens to me, what will he find? She was not afraid for herself. That was the thing she kept examining and kept finding to be true. She was not afraid of what the person who left the bottles might do to her if they discovered she had been collecting them. She was not afraid of retaliation or confrontation. What she was afraid of was the bureaucratic consequence. The version of events in which she had known for months, had collected 4 bottles worth of evidence, had said nothing to anyone at the hotel, and was now holding contraband in her closet. The version in which her silence made her complicit rather than prudent. This fear had its own particular weight, and it was heavier than the other kind. She had navigated enough institutions to know that the person who notices something and waits is rarely treated the same as the person who notices nothing. The passage of time had a way of becoming suspicious in retrospect, even when the silence had been chosen out of reasonable fear rather than complicity. She had known this going in some wordless way, and she had stayed silent anyway, and now the months of silence sat in her chest like something calcified. It was Anna who made the difference in the end. Not through any action she took, not through any knowledge she had. Anna knew nothing about room 114 and nothing about Celestine's months of quiet vigil. What Anna did was leave a cup of coffee on Celestine's cart one Tuesday morning with a small note that said simply, "You look like you haven't been sleeping." That was all. No question. No invitation to explain. Just the acknowledgement that someone had looked at her carefully enough to see something true. Celestine stood with the coffee in her hands in the east corridor and felt something give way in her chest. Not dramatically, not with any outward expression, but quietly, the way ice gives way in early spring, all at once and then gradually. She did not tell Anna. But that evening, in the hour before her son came home, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down. Not for anyone yet, just for herself. The dates, the room number, the pattern of check-ins, a description of the bottles, what she had noticed about the front desk employee, the 4 bottles in her closet. She wrote it in the small, deliberate script she had developed for the notes she sent home to her mother, a script that communicated care through its very precision. She read it back 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the same box where she kept her important documents. She had decided, not dramatically, not with any sense of resolution or courage. She had decided the way people decide most things, after a long time of already knowing, through exhaustion and the slow failure of every other option. She would go to Marcus. She would tell him what she had seen. She would bring the note she had written. She would not bring the bottles yet. Some instinct told her to hold that back, to give herself one more layer of protection before she handed everything over. She would see how he received what she told him first. She would read the room the way she had been reading rooms her whole working life. She asked to speak with him the following morning before the shift began. He found them a corner of the break room before anyone else arrived. She set the folded note on the table between them and began. She spoke for 7 minutes without interruption. She had counted the time later, trying to assess whether she had said too much or too little. 7 minutes to convey 4 months of observation. She watched his face change as she spoke, not with surprise exactly, but with a quality of attention that shifted as he understood the scope of what she was describing. He asked 3 questions. She answered each one precisely. When she finished, he looked at the table for a long moment. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since August," she said. It was now November. He nodded. He did not ask why she had waited. She was grateful for this and also suspicious of it. The absence of the accusatory question felt deliberate, which meant he was already thinking about something other than her reasons for waiting. He picked up the note. He read it through twice. "I need to make some calls," he said. "I need you to stay available today. Don't speak to anyone else about this." She had not spoken to anyone else about it for 4 months. Staying silent for 1 more day was the easiest thing she had been asked to do in a long time. What Marcus had recognized that morning, though he didn't yet know the full shape of it, was that Celestine had described something that aligned with a series of financial irregularities that the hotel's ownership had been quietly investigating for the past 2 months. The Monday early check-ins for room 114 had not appeared in the reservation system the way normal bookings appeared. Someone inside the hotel had been processing them off-book, taking cash, issuing physical keys without electronic records, and keeping the room essentially invisible to the system's occupancy tracking. The front desk employee Celestine had noticed, the young man who worked Sunday nights into Monday mornings, had been at the center of the investigation's suspicion for 6 weeks. But without physical evidence of what was happening in the room, the investigators had had nothing to anchor the theory to. They knew money was moving. They knew the room existed in a gray space in the records. They did not know what the room was being used for. Celestine knew. She had been finding out every Monday morning for 4 months. The evidence was on a shelf in her closet behind a pair of shoes. She was asked to come to the hotel's administrative offices that afternoon. It was the first time in 11 years she had been in that part of the building. The carpet was a different color. There were framed photographs on the walls, the hotel in earlier decades, empty corridors preserved in black and white. A man she had never seen before was seated at the table when she entered. He introduced himself as a representative from the ownership group. He thanked her for coming. She sat down and set the folded note on the table and folded her hands on top of it and waited. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. She had expected interrogation. She received instead something that felt disorienting in its formality, a careful, systematic documentation of everything she had observed, conducted with a procedural respect that was nothing like the side-of-the-mouth warnings she had received in the past. They asked her the same questions several times in different ways, which she recognized as verification rather than doubt. She answered each time with the same words, because the truth does not change under repetition. At some point she said quietly, "I have the bottles at home." The room went still. She brought them in the following morning, 4 small orange prescription bottles carried in a paper bag from the grocery store near her apartment. She set them on the table without ceremony. The investigator on the other side of the table looked at them for a moment, then looked at her, then nodded once, a gesture that contained more acknowledgement than anything she had received in 11 years of working in the corridors outside. An outside investigative firm was already involved. The bottles were taken into evidence. She was told her name would be held confidentially during the review process. She was told she had done the right thing. She sat very still when she heard this and said nothing. The review took 6 weeks. During that time, Celestine continued her shifts. She cleaned room 114 on Monday mornings, with no bottle on the nightstand. The pattern had broken, either because the participants had sensed something shifting or because the off-book bookings had been suspended as part of the investigation. The room felt different without it, emptier somehow in the way a familiar weight feels different by its absence. She did not tell Anna. She did not tell her son. She cleaned her rooms and completed her clipboards and returned her cart to the storage room, and went home in the evenings and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that had been her life for many years. Her son began leaving tea on the table when he heard her key in the lock. She noticed this without commenting on it. He had inherited her way of showing things. The front desk employee was dismissed 6 weeks into the investigation, quietly on a Thursday afternoon. 3 other employees in adjacent roles faced formal reviews. A segment of the hotel's booking and key management procedures was restructured. These things happened in the administrative spaces that Celestine had visited once and would not visit again. They rippled outward through the building in the way institutional changes always do, through slightly different procedures, slightly different forms, the subtle reorganization of tasks that most workers absorbed without knowing why. No announcement was made to the housekeeping staff. No explanation was offered for the procedural changes. Celestine learned the details of the outcome not from any official source but from Marcus, who sought her out on a Tuesday morning in the linen closet where she was restocking, a space she had associated until now with private crying rather than private truths. He told her briefly what had happened, what had been found, what consequence had followed. He told her that her documentation had been essential to the process. She listened with her hands still on the stack of folded towels. "The ownership wanted me to tell you," he said, "that they'd like to recognize your contribution formally. There's a letter being prepared." She thought about this for a moment. "I don't need a letter," she said. "It would go in your file," he said, "if you ever needed it." She thought about that differently, a letter in her file. Evidence in an institutional record that she had been the person who had noticed something and reported it correctly, and had not been wrong to trust that reporting it was the right choice. Something that would be there even if she were not there to speak for herself. "All right," she said, "I'll take the letter." The letter arrived 2 weeks later, in a sealed envelope on her cart, placed there by a front desk employee she didn't recognize, which struck her as the hotel's particular way of doing things, the important communications always arriving through indirect channels, as though no one wanted to be the one to hand them to her. She put it in her bag without opening it until she was home, seated at the kitchen table with her son in the next room, playing music through his headphones. She read it once. It was precise, formal, and entirely correct in its account of what she had done and why it mattered. She folded it once and put it in the box with her important documents, beside the note she had written to herself in November, which had never been returned to her. The note she had written had passed out of her possession and into the institution's keeping, which was how things always went. You gave what you knew to the system, and the system absorbed it and kept going, and you went back to cleaning the rooms. She went back to cleaning the rooms, but something had shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to in a single conversation or a single moment. The shift was the kind that happens beneath the surface of a person's life, a change in the quality of the silence, in what the silence contained. She had been carrying something for 4 months that no one had known she was carrying, and now the carrying was over. The bottles were gone from her closet. The note was gone from her possession. The pattern in room 114 was gone. She was still the same person who pushed the same cart down the same corridor, but she was carrying less. Anna noticed before anyone. She noticed in the way that people who pay close attention to others notice changes, not through explicit observation, but through the cumulative impression of small things shifting back toward baseline. Celestine moved differently. She answered questions slightly faster. She stayed at the coffee machine an extra 40 seconds in the morning, rather than taking her cup and moving immediately on. One morning, about 3 weeks after the letter, Anna looked at her across the break room and said, "You look better." Celestine considered this. "I've been sleeping," she said. Anna nodded and asked nothing else. Some things explain themselves. There is a version of this story that is about crime and investigation and institutional corruption. That version exists and it is accurate. And if you were to look at what happened from the perspective of the ownership group or the investigative firm, you would see a story about financial irregularity, procedural failure, and corrective action. You would see charts and summaries and a remediated booking system and a quietly departed employee. That version of the story is clean and resolves itself neatly in a report that was likely filed and archived and will never be read by anyone outside the organization. But the version that actually happened, the version that was lived, was about a woman standing in a corridor every Monday morning for 4 months, holding a small orange bottle that no one had told her to pick up and deciding what she was. She had been told once not to generate incidents. She had spent 11 years honoring that instruction. The instruction had been given in good faith by a supervisor who was also navigating a system that did not reward housekeepers for bringing problems to light. Celestine had understood this at the time. She still understood it. The instruction had been correct in the context in which it was given, but the instruction had not anticipated room 114. It had not anticipated the particular consistency of the thing she found there, which crossed some threshold after 4 months that turned noticing into knowledge, and knowledge into a thing she could no longer carry without deciding what she intended to do with it. The instruction had been given for small things. What she had found was not a small thing. The distinction between these two sizes was something she had had to locate inside herself without guidance over 4 months of Monday mornings. Her son found out the following spring, not from her but from Marcus, whom he encountered at the hotel's employee family event, an annual afternoon gathering that Celestine attended out of obligation, and her son attended that year for the first time at her suggestion. Marcus shook his hand and said, with the directness of someone unaware that the other person didn't already know, "Your mother is the most careful person in this building." Her son came to find her afterward, where she was standing near the window with a glass of water, and he looked at her differently, or perhaps the same way, but with an additional thing added to it. "What did he mean?" he asked. She thought about this for a while before answering. "I found something," she said, "and I figured out what to do with it." He waited. She did not elaborate. He had inherited enough of her to know when the silence was a wall, and when it was a door, and this was a door. She was not refusing to tell him. She was telling him in the only way she had ever told him important things, which was through reduction, through the essential truth stripped of decoration. "Were you scared?" he asked. "Not of the right things," she said. "Not at first." He thought about this. "Are you okay now?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it, which was the thing that surprised her about her own answer. She had expected to feel, in retrospect, the accumulated weight of those 4 months. The sleeplessness, the kitchen table evenings, the careful watching, the slow decision. She had expected that looking back would make the burden heavier through the knowledge of how long she had carried it alone. But what she felt, standing at the window with her son beside her, was closer to the feeling of having arrived somewhere than the feeling of having survived something. The months were still real. The weight had been real. But it had been carried in a direction that turned out to matter. This is what no one tells you about the people who clean the spaces where we fall apart. They are paying attention. Not always, not everyone, not all the time. The work is repetitive and the hours are long, and the attention required for the work is the kind that focuses on surfaces and sequences and does not necessarily extend to the particular contents of a nightstand. But some of them are paying attention. Some of them are carrying knowledge that no one asked them to carry, that no one thanked them for noticing, that no institution equipped them to report safely. Some of them are standing in corridors on Monday mornings, deciding what they are. Celestine did not think of herself as a whistleblower. She did not think of herself as someone who had done something exceptional. What she had done was notice a thing, and persist in noticing it, and eventually find a way to hand the noticing to someone who could act on it. This was, to her, a version of what she had always done. Attention directed carefully, work completed correctly, nothing left undone that could be done. She had simply applied the same principles she applied to the rooms, to the larger problem in front of her. She continued working in the East Corridor. She continued cleaning room 114 on Monday mornings. The room had gone back to its orderly blankness. Different guests each week now, the pattern broken. Nothing on the nightstand except the occasional water glass or phone charger, the ordinary debris of temporary lives. She restored order to it as she restored order to every room, with the same quiet care she had always brought to the work. She was not thanked by the guests. She was not thanked by most of her colleagues, who knew nothing of what she had done. She was thanked in a letter in her file, and by Marcus when they passed in the corridor, and by Anna without words, and by her son who had begun leaving tea on the table when she came home. This was enough. Not because it was all she deserved more, and she knew it. with the clear-eyed accuracy of a woman who has never asked for what she deserved because she has always known the asking would not be heard. It was enough because it was real. The letter was real, the tea on the table was real. The bottles were out of her closet and in an evidence box somewhere, and the room was clean and empty every time she walked into it, and the weight between her shoulder blades had gone. She had arrived, quietly, without anyone watching. The way she had always done everything that mattered. There is a particular dignity that belongs to people who have learned to be unseen. Not the dignity of performance, not the dignity of recognition. Those require witnesses, require an audience to ratify the quality of a person's character. This other kind is the dignity that exists in the absence of witnesses, in the moments when no one is watching, and the choice is made anyway, not because someone will notice, but because it is what you are. Celestine had this kind of dignity. She had been building it for a long time, in hotel corridors and linen closets and kitchen tables, in the spaces between what was required of her and what she chose to do regardless. 4 months of Monday mornings, 11 years before that. A lifetime of learning to occupy spaces as something other than a visible person, to be the kind of presence that the architecture of a building's day requires but does not acknowledge. She had moved through the hotel's systems as a function, housekeeping, East Corridor, room 114, and somewhere in those 11 years and those 4 particular months, she had become the only person in the building who knew the thing that changed how the building understood itself. The hotel made several quiet changes in the months after the investigation concluded. A new key management system was implemented, electronic, logged, with 3-step verification for early check-ins. A second employee was required to be present for any booking that came through outside normal hours. The housekeeping department was given a new incident reporting protocol, one that included a confidential channel for reporting observations without requiring the reporting employee to speak with anyone directly above them first. This last change was proposed by Marcus and approved by ownership without much discussion. Celestine learned about the new protocol from the sheet posted in the break room. She read it twice, standing with her coffee before Anna came to stand beside her. "Did you know about this?" Anna asked. "No," Celestine said, which was technically true. They read it together in silence. The protocol described exactly what Celestine had done, except that it described a process that would have taken 4 months of sleeplessness and kitchen table evenings and removed them, would have given her, at the start, a path that she had had to find herself, slowly, in the dark. She felt something about this that was not quite anger, and not quite grief and not quite relief, but some unnamed thing that sat in the space between all three. She had paid with her body and her sleep, and her months of careful isolation, for the knowledge that such a path was necessary. The institution had absorbed that knowledge and built it into a procedure, which was how institutions learned, through the costs paid by individuals that the institution itself did not fully absorb. This was not a complaint. It was an observation. She was a person who noticed things. She had noticed this too. She added it to the long, wordless list of things she had noticed and not said aloud, and she finished her coffee and went to clean her rooms. 6 months after the investigation concluded, Celestine was asked if she would be willing to speak to new housekeeping staff during their onboarding. Not about what had happened, not about room 114 or bottles or investigations, just about the work, about how to do it well, about what it meant to pay attention in spaces that belonged temporarily to other people. She considered the request for 2 days before accepting it. She stood in front of 7 new employees on a Thursday morning in a conference room she had only ever passed while pushing her cart. She told them about the work, the sequences, the attention required, the particular intelligence of noticing the difference between what belonged in a room and what didn't. She told them about the incident reporting protocol. She told them without drama that reporting things was not the same as generating incidents, that there was a difference between making trouble and naming what was true. She spoke for 20 minutes. She took 3 questions. She thanked them for their attention and left before anyone could ask her follow-up questions. One of the new employees, a young woman who had been watching her for the full 20 minutes with the focused attention of someone taking notes even when their hands were still, caught up with her in the hallway outside. "Have you ever had to use the reporting protocol yourself?" the woman asked. Celestine looked at her. She had the direct examining quality of someone who had arrived from somewhere that had required directness, who had not yet learned to ask sideways. "Before there was a protocol," Celestine said. "Yes." The young woman nodded. "Was it scary?" "It was lonely," Celestine said. "Those aren't the same thing." She returned to the east corridor. She pulled her cart to room 114. She entered with her passkey, propped the door open, and began the systematic dismantling of someone else's temporary life, stripping the bed, collecting the damp towels, noting on her clipboard what needed restocking. The room was clean and ordinary, and held nothing except the quiet evidence of a stranger's ordinary night. She restored it to its neutral blankness with the care she had always brought to the work. She left no trace that she had been there. This was her function. This was what she was good at. And when she pulled the door closed behind her and moved her cart down the corridor toward the next room, she carried nothing but what she had always carried: the steady, quiet knowledge of what she was and what it was worth, even in the rooms where no one had thought to ask. If you've ever done the right thing in a place that gave you no protection for doing it, quietly, alone, without guarantee that anyone would notice, leave a word in the comments. You don't need to explain it. Just let it be seen.